Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education, and it's wonderful to have you with us today on another chilly day in Atlanta. We're thrilled to have Brandon Smith back to our Business Over Breakfast. Brandon is a key presenter in our upcoming Executive Communications and Leadership Presence course, starting here, March 26th at Goizueta. It's in person. And today he's going to give a preview of a critical leadership attribute that he's going to focus on in that program, the secret to developing executive presence. We've all heard the term executive presence, but what exactly does it mean? It feels a little elusive. AI's definition, we like to infuse AI into things these days. So AI's definition is executive presence is a combination of qualities that leaders exhibit to inspire confidence, command respect, and project authority. I'm not sure that's easy to do, though. So fortunately, we have Brandon here to help us decipher, decode what that all means. Brandon is an affiliate faculty at Goizueta Business School, an award-winning instructor, TED Talk presenter, and the author of 2 great books, and I understand a third one on its way. So the 2 books that are out there are The Author versus Editor Dilemma and The Hot Sauce Principle. As usual, Brandon's going to spend about 30-35 minutes talking about executive presence, and then we'll pepper that with questions along the way and also at the end. But before I hand over, I just wanted to say a few words about what we focus on in executive education, which is really to equip today's and tomorrow's leaders with the perspectives, the skills, and the tools to be successful. So not only do we do short courses on executive presence with faculty like Brandon, we also have a series of learning opportunities focused on new technologies, AI, leveraging analytics, digital disruption, and that's both in person and online. This is such an important area that we've even updated our design thinking course to include leveraging AI as a source of new ideas. I just completed the digital disruption and transformation course. It was fabulous, actually, and am planning to enroll on a second one. Maybe the leveraging AI for business that starts April 30th, not quite sure yet. So anyway, we will put some information in the chat about those courses so that you can think about both sides of the leadership coin, the executive presence and communications, but also the technological perspectives and skills that you also need to be successful today. A couple of last things. For those of you with a coaching practice who would like to grow your business, we have a new 4-part workshop on the business of coaching, strategies to boost your coaching practice. So please, again, we'll put information in the chat around that. Registration closes Friday. So if you are a new or even a seasoned coach, but you want to expand your business, please consider that. And then for those of you in Atlanta, March 12th, I sent an email out to all of you, the session with Dorotea Bozzicolona Volpe on LinkedIn from basics to beyond in person at Goizueta Business School. That's enough from me. Brandon, over to you.
Nicola, thank you. I'm really excited to be with you all here today. Excited about our topic. We're going to talk about executive presence. And as Nicola said, this is one of the topics we cover in our course, Leadership Presence and Executive Communication. It's a course that we offer twice a year. I would be thrilled if any of you were interested after this session and wanted to learn more. Please reach out to the team. But for today, we're going to do a deep dive into what does it mean to have executive presence. We all get to a point in our career where we're being evaluated on this. And so what most of my clients experience is that evaluation is pretty mysterious. It's almost kind of like folks say, well, I know it when I see it. So we're going to try and demystify it here today. Now, Nicola hinted that I've got a 3rd book on the way. It's actually on executive presence. So I'm giving you all a little bit of a sneak peek into the book I'm working on right now and the traits that I've been identifying over the last 10 years of doing research on this topic. That said, I invite you to challenge any of the traits, offer up your own ideas, essentially help me write this book. So if you've got some strong points of view that you feel like I've missed, I would be open to that. So why don't we go ahead and start our journey? So for us today, we're going to talk about the secret to developing executive presence, how you can do that in your own world. Now, one more important point around executive presence. It is culturally and contextually specific. So if we're in a small tech startup, executive presence is going to look different than if, say, we work for a large global bank, for example. And the region of the world might affect this as well. That said, most of the traits you see, I've stress tested them and they tend to hold up in most environments. So for our time today, just to give you a little bit of objectives, we're going to cover a few things. We're going to define what does it mean to have executive presence. We're going to discuss practical ways to strengthen one's executive presence and identify one thing you could be doing more of or differently that might help you think about executive presence and developing your own. So here is the kind of orienting slide you're going to see quite a bit in our time here today. I'm going to essentially kind of reveal traits. We're going to build this together. I'm going to start on the left-hand column and we'll move all the way over to the right-hand column. The left-hand column and the traits I'm going to start with first are going to be our fundamentals. So think of that left-hand column as all the fundamentals that you've got to have kind of an ante to play, so to speak. And then the column on the right, that's going to be some of the more sneaky or complex elements of executive presence that tend to trip up my clients. No one tells them about these and causes them challenges. So let's start with the left-hand column first.
Brandon,
So,
Brandon,
yes,
just a quick question. Gary asks, is it same is the same true for executive presence in for-profits as not-for-profits?
Yes, for the most part, you're going to see it's exactly the same. The difference that's going to change, Gary, is going to be the size of the organization. So a large nonprofit, you're going to see some of these traits, particularly the ones on the right, play out even more critically. Because the more folks we've got, the more we need to attend to that. So for example, going slower is one of the traits of executive presence, learning how to slow down so we can bring everyone along. You've got a 10-person nonprofit, and not quite as critical as if you have a 100,000-person nonprofit. But great question. So our first kind of opening group of executive presence traits are the ones you see on the slide in front of you. Listens, leads with questions, recognizes others, confident and humble, and then considers the audience. Now, I've clustered these together because not only are they kind of a nice entry point to how we need to show up as executives and leaders, we could also categorize this group as the label of it's not about you. So if we keep ourselves oriented about ourselves, it's going to be hard to show up as having executive presence, at least the kind that we want to have. And so this set is all about others. We could also use the word care as another proxy word for some of these. So I'm going to do a little bit of a dive into one of these. We're going to talk about kind of recognizing others. So there's been about 30 years of research studying traits of high-performing teams. And what they found was in those high-performing teams, they gave each other positive to negative interactions at a ratio of 5-to-1. 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. I used to call this feedback, but I found interactions is a little more accurate word because feedback is an interaction, but so is a funny meme or an inside joke or other ways that we build that connection. And as executives, it's important that we're giving that positive feedback and recognition to our teams, as well as that redirecting feedback that we'll see in that number 1. Now, the reason why I love this slide so much in this ratio is we see it pop up in other elements of life. So the Gottman Institute, which studies marriages and personal relationships and partnerships around the globe, when they study couples that have been together a long time and seem to have a really healthy dynamic, when they watch those 2 individuals speak to each other and they coded their language, turns out they're giving each other 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. Exactly the same ratio. And they were completely unaware of this other research. And then the third unrelated piece of research studying kids with behavioral disorders, they found the easiest way to help kiddos overcome behavioral disorders is to give them positive to negative feedback at a ratio of 4-to-1. So what we're seeing here is a life truth. If we want folks to change their behavior and walk with us over a long period of time, we've got to be giving more positive than negative. So it's an important trait for us as executives. We need to find ways to recognize others. So this slide is my happy feedback tree. It represents different ways that we can give feedback and recognition to others. I've loosely rank ordered these as most emotional bump at the top of the tree to least emotional bump at the bottom of the tree. So you can see handwritten notes number one. We got face-to-face number two. We got video calls, email, text. I won't go into a lot of these today, but I do want to acknowledge the importance of something as simple as handwritten note. So one of my colleagues at goizueta is retired Lieutenant General Ken Keene. And I've had Ken on my podcast several times. I love just picking his brain and hearing his stories. He has such a rich career as a leader, as an executive. And on my podcast a few years ago, we were talking about the idea of giving positive feedback. And Ken told me this great story. He said some years ago, he'd encountered a struggling junior officer. And he was just concerned about the junior officer. So he wrote him a note, handwritten note, just kind of to motivate him and inspire him and tell him, I believe in you. About that time, Ken moved on to another assignment, and he'd lost touch with that junior officer. About 15 years passed, and he bumped into that junior officer, and it was in the Pentagon, and that junior officer had gotten promoted multiple times. And Ken was so excited to see him. He was no longer a junior officer, a much more senior officer at this point. And the officer took Ken into his office and posted right there above the officer's desk was Ken's note, the note he'd written 15 years before. And the officer said to him, Ken, that's your note. Ken said, I know, I can see it. I can't believe you still have that. And the officer said, that was such an important note for me. It was meaningful and transformative. I thought I was going to quit the military, but knowing someone like you believed in me, ever since I got that note, when I got a new assignment, I always posted that note above my desk as a reminder that someone like you believed in me. So executive presence can, not only is it about giving recognition, it can have those kinds of impacts. And it's making the time to do it. So that's our first kind of grouping of executive presence. We could call that grouping. Again, it's not about you. Of course, there's a lot more that could go into all of these. Frankly, we could write a book on each of these topics. So that's our first grouping. Our second cluster is a nice pairing to that first cluster. So while the first cluster is all about it's not about you, the second cluster is about driving clarity. Executives are really skilled at driving clarity. So they balance that relational and operational. They're very clear on goals, objectives, roles, expectations, and so you can see things like decisive, even quality versus quantity in communication. So the folks that have executive presence, they're not the ones that talk the most. They're typically the ones that when they talk, everyone stops and listens. They're really thoughtful about their words. So when I teach communication courses, even when I've teach it to full-time MBA students over the years, I would regularly remind them that whenever we're communicating, we're either adding value or diluting from existing value. It's that simple. We're either adding value or diluting from existing value. And we've all gotten those emails that are more like diluting from existing value. It's paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. And we think to ourselves, gosh, if you could have put that into about 5 bullets, sure would have been more helpful. So it's really being thoughtful and precise. And that's not an easy skill to do, but of course, that's what makes it executive presence. So just to kind of hit this point a little harder or a little more clear, no pun intended. This is one of my principles of effective leadership communication. When we talk about communicating as leaders, clarity is a key piece to this. So back in my clinical therapy days, as well as my teaching days and corporate days today, it hit me not too many years ago that dysfunction's like a fungus. It lives in dark places. If we can clarify our expectations to eliminate it. Or another way to say this, we can cure and prevent 50% of all people-related dysfunction in our careers and lives by driving clear expectations. Not only our expectations of them, but their expectations of us. I'm doing a lot of work right now on teaching cultures of accountability and helping work with teams to create cultures of accountability. And it all starts with that clarity of expectations. That's our starting place. And skilled executives are very, very good at this. So that's just a good kind of follow-on point to that second cluster, driving that level of clarity, kind of that operational communication. Now, one more final point before I move on to our final critical trait on our first column. We want to keep operational and relational communication in balance. So when we're relational, we're listening, we're trying to consider the audience, we're providing feedback, positive feedback, encouragement, all those good things. And then operational communication is when we're giving feedback on how the person's performing, where they stand. We're being clear on expectations and goals and roles. You can think of that as a spectrum. We want somewhere in middle-ish is important. Now, the middle-ish is important too, because as I mentioned earlier, context matters. So maybe you're in an organization or you inherited a team and there's some broken systems and processes. We might need to lean a little operationally to fix that stuff. Or perhaps you've inherited a team or a group, trust is a little low. We might need to lean a little more relational to rebuild trust. But we want the middle. We get into problems if we go too far to either side. So if we're too relational, folks often describe those leaders as nice, but I don't know where I stand or what we're supposed to work on. If we're too operational, folks describe those leaders as cold. I know where I stand, but it feels like I could leave tomorrow and they wouldn't care. They would just replace me with another warm or cold body. So we want to keep those in balance. So everything so far in that first column is really about the balance of those two critical elements, relational and operational. Well, we'll round out our first column with our final one. This is often where our heads go when we think about executive presence. We think about how we should dress. And attire and polish is one element, but you can see it's one of many. Sometimes I think we over-index on this one. So it's all about making sure that we are intentional and put together in a way that represents the organization that we're working for, and making sure that the way that we show up doesn't distract or take away from the words that come out of our mouth. That is the best way to think about appearance when it comes to executive presence. It's not about being the sharpest person in the room from a dress standpoint. That's not necessarily true. No research has kind of pointed to that. What it really indicates is we need to make sure that we're dressing in a way that honors our role, honors the organization, and does not distract from what we're saying. So for example, I work with all different kinds of organizations. I've worked with startups before, tech startups. And I'll typically show up in Vans and jeans and kind of a loose dress shirt. And that's appropriate for that environment. If I showed up in a suit and tie, they would not want to hear much I'd have to say. They'd say, "Who is this weird guy? This is not how we show up." And the flip is true. If I show up in Bank of America in Vans and jeans and loose shirt, they're going to say he's clearly not professional. So understanding the environment and adjusting is also important. Okay, so that's our first column. So what I would encourage you to do is just kind of think about that first column. From that list of traits on the first column, any reactions you might have, feel free to share those or any questions you might have via chat. Happy to field those either as we go through our current list right now or wait until the very end. So that's our first column. Think about that as our foundational elements of executive presence, those things that are critical to just be considered in the game. So
Brandon,
yes, Nicola.
got a question that came about the gentleman in the photo whose hands are folded with a wonderful smile. What communication message do you think he's expressing? So there's sort of verbal and there's non-verbal communications.
So I'm assuming this picture here, Nicola?
Yes.
So it depends upon how it's received. The posture would be a confident posture. When we have hands across like this, that's kind of showing confidence or kind of we're in charge the way he's doing it. He's not necessarily holding himself like he's insecure. He's coming across confidently. And then his face has got a warm smile, so that's more relational. So we might say it's kind of a combination of kind of inviting, but also confident would be something he might be communicating here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Nicola.
Yeah.
So we're going to move into the second column. And as we move into this, I want to just share a fun little anecdote I had from a senior HR leader some years ago. She said to me, and I think so true and so simple. She said, do you know the three most important conversations about anyone's career happen when they are not in the room? Are we going to hire this person? Are we going to promote this person? And of course, hopefully not the last conversation. Are we inviting this person to find another home? We're not in the room for those, but our brand is, how people see us is in the room. And so when we think about executive presence, it's a more advanced way of saying our leadership brand. It's what folks think about us when they hear our name. So that's, of course, why we're talking about this here today. So let's move into the second column, the little more complicated column, the sneakier column. This is the column where most of the subtler pitfalls happen. So here's our first cluster here. The first one here, global systemic thinking and ability enabled to synthesize quickly. That's almost standalone by itself. And I don't know if that's something that can be developed, but essentially executives with strong executive presence have the ability to kind of go up and down the elevator. They can go all the way to the penthouse and think strategically and big picture. They can see the forest. They can also drop all the way down to the boiler room and kind of see the trees. They can talk about tactics and what needs to happen. So that's an element. Again, I'm not quite sure if we can fully develop that all the way. Most folks tend to have a bank of elevators that they hang out at. They're more of a, first to 10th floor group or a 11th to 20th floor group. And then there's those rare leaders that can go all the way up and down. The other two, however, we can develop. That's works to align and supports other leaders publicly. These are tricky for us because often when we're moving up into executive ranks, we're competing with our peers. The whole time we're interviewing for opportunities, and who are we interviewing against? The person who sits to our left and the person who sits to our right. And so now we reach an executive level, and now you're being told, don't compete with them. They're on the same team. So I was working with this would happen to be a manufacturing facility that was the best manufacturing facility in the whole chain of this particular business. And they were fantastic, but they were very reluctant to share their best practices with other facilities. And so it ties into kind of these 2 points here. I was doing a workshop with them some years ago, and I pulled up this slide. And some of you may know who this person is. This is an NBA basketball player from primarily from the 1980s, pretty well known. If you don't know who this basketball player is, this is Earvin Magic Johnson, arguably one of the best basketball players of all time. And these are just some of the highlights of some things that Earvin Magic Johnson achieved in his career: a 5-time NBA champ, 3-time NBA MVP, 12-time NBA All-Star, NBA Hall of Fame. But for our conversation here today, the most important point is he is 5th all-time in assists. So I was doing a workshop on executive presence a few years ago, and the group of leaders there used a basketball analogy. And this is what they said to me. They said, what gets you promoted to the executive ranks is scoring lots of points. 45 points a night. That's what gets you promoted. They said, but that's not executive presence. Executive presence is a combination of points and assists. Maybe you don't score 45 points. Maybe you score more like 40 points or 35 points, but you pass the ball a lot. You're helping other leaders in the business score. You're facilitating kind of overall team winning, even if you're not the one scoring the most points. So I love this example of using Magic Johnson, as that was the key to his success, was passing to make all his teammates around him better. And when we talk about some of those elements, like works to align and supports other leaders publicly, those are key traits that need to happen when we're developing executive presence. We want to start developing those at director level, but once you hit VP level and above, you need to be doing this. So when you're in meetings, make sure you publicly recognize in the meeting other leaders that are maybe your peers or even more senior that are doing a great job. Here's our next cluster. You can see these measured in responses, is careful with humor, drives slower in order to bring everyone along, and avoids thinking out loud. So this has a combination of intentionality and a slower pace. That's really, really key. And why, again, the theme of the second column is counterintuitive and maybe even a little challenging, Because why those are so challenging is so often we get promoted when we move fast, make quick decisions, don't worry about driving slower. In fact, we might get punished if we drive too slow. We love to see those managers that just get stuff done quick, but it can cause problems, particularly when we've got thousands and thousands of employees. We've got to make sure we're measured in bringing everyone along. We can't just make a decision and go. There's a stream of communication that needs to happen to make sure we're not missing anybody and being
Brandon,
intentional about that. Nicola.
sorry, there's a bit of an personal oops on those last couple. I know what I need to practice. Somebody asked, what do you do? Back to the previous slide. What do you do when you pass the ball for an assist and someone keeps dropping it?
Okay. So if you've done it more than once and they keep dropping it, then I would probably say, don't pass that ball to them again. Just like in a basketball game, if they're not scoring, pass it to somebody else. That said, you can go over and offer your support or assistance. So say, I've noticed that the last couple of times we've kind of collaborated and worked on some things. It's been a challenge. Is there something I could be doing differently that might help you? So I think we can still go back and borrow from our first column. It's not about us, and just get curious and say, how can I help? Because obviously just handing you this client, there was a piece there that would have been more helpful than me just making that contact or connection, if that was the example. So
Yeah, thank you.
I think a follow-up just to check in and say, what more could I be doing? Would honor the spirit without the negative outcome. Yeah. So going back to this next cluster here, this measured in responses, careful with humor, drive slower, and avoids thinking out loud. A couple things I would want to add to this one here. So when we talk about measured in responses, one of the challenging things for leaders that I work with that are passionate, we love working with passionate leaders, is they can have challenges with the measured in responses. When we're passionate, we tend to be passionate regardless. So we're passionate about inspiring people and motivating people about the mission of our organization and what we're trying to do. But we also get passionate when someone upsets us. And sometimes that can cause problems. So it's learning when to dial down the passion when we're upset, but keep the passion high when we are trying to motivate and inspire. Typically that exercise, and that's another element around executive presence, typically that exercise occurs in our 40s. Our decade of our 40s is when we learn to manage our passion, manage some of the elements on this list I'm just mentioning right here, avoids thinking out loud, kind of some of that self-control, and particularly navigating and learning politics. That's typically what happens in our 40s. It's why it's very difficult to kind of skip that step. It just takes time. Now, it's possible to be in your 30s and have some of this down, but it really does just take practice and self-awareness. Careful with humor. That's another one. When we're managers, we can make jokes about things that people think are funny. If we're executives, we make the same joke. It cannot land quite so well. So I find that with each promotion, the areas we can make fun of get smaller and smaller, until ultimately, when we're C-level executive, the only thing we can really safely make fun of is ourselves. We can make fun of ourselves, and we have to be careful we don't do it too much, because that can also cut into our credibility if we're always self-deprecating. So just another way to think about kind of humor. And then finally, avoids thinking out loud. So a few years ago, I was on a podcast as a guest, and the podcast host was a serial entrepreneur. And he had this really interesting example when we got to this topic of thinking out loud. He said, yeah, he said, I'm not very good at this. I've got to work on this. He said, one of my businesses is a logistics business, trucking and shipping. He said, we've got all these van fleets, and it's a small family-owned business, but it does great work. He said, one year we had finished up the year and I was doing the town hall, and they had a great year. And I was so excited. I was celebrating as I was thanking the team. And I made a comment to the team. I said, we had such a great year. We should probably think about expanding our van fleet. Something to think about as we go into the next year. But really, really great job, team. I keep up all the great work. He said he leaves, he goes home, sleeps like a baby that night, feels so good about how the day went, drove back into the office the next day, and then parked in his usual parking spot. Next to his usual parking spot was now 6 brand new white vans. Goes into his desk, and there on his desk is 6 purchase orders, brand new vans. He said, let's think about maybe we should add some vans. They heard, go buy me 6 brand new vans. So what's interesting is, as an executive, when we think out loud, it's translated into a decision's been made, and this is something I want you to go do. So we have to be careful that we don't make off the cuff comments in large environments like town halls, because they can be blown way out of proportion. So
Brandon,
yes, Nicola.
so thinking out loud is something I'm very good at. Who is it? Bridget asks, how do you differentiate thinking out loud versus being collaborative and brainstorming in a meeting? I mean, which is where I think I come from, but obviously I need to.
100%. So if some of you may remember our other business over breakfast sessions I've done, I did a trust formula where we talked about it's authenticity plus vulnerability, multiply times credibility. And we talk about authenticity really being transparency, sharing our thinking and our motives. That's important when we build trust. So the way we want to think about thinking out loud is that we want to do that. It's important to do that with a trusted team behind closed doors. And we want to clearly state that we're about to do this. So we want to put good parameters around it. Hey, team, let's just spend the next 30 minutes thinking out loud. No decisions are being made. I'm going to throw out some ideas. I'm not suggesting that we have to do any of these. Let's just have a good brainstorming session together. Doing that with your kind of trusted team of lieutenants or peers is exactly appropriate. When we do that in large town halls, it can be hard to rein in the interpretation of what we're doing, and it can get a life of its own. So that's the way I would parse that out, Nicola.
So consider the audience, which is on your left-hand side.
That's right. That's right. And Nicola, I love that you did that. You're exactly right. All these, they're all ingredients and can be paired together to create kind of just the right flavor. Yeah, that's
Wonderful.
right.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so just again, building on some of these ideas of making sure that we're hitting some of those key elements, not thinking out loud, driving a little bit slower to bring everyone along, being careful with humor. It all requires a little more intentionality and a slightly more measured pace. I'm not going to say slower pace, more measured pace. And I'm mentioning this, bringing up the slide here because forces are working against us as executives and leaders. So as leaders, we're always trying to balance efficient and effective, these two things. We're always trying to balance that. Efficiency, effectiveness, speed and quality, speed and quality. Well, as you all know, have heard me before, we live in a world where everything is urgent all the time, and time's our most precious resource. Everything's kind of covered in hot sauce. And when we feel that sense of urgency, we tend to go faster. And when we tend to go faster, a little bit of speed isn't a problem. Too much speed causes problems. We get unforced errors. We make a comment that we need to walk back, or we make a funny joke that doesn't land well. We're just not thinking it all the way through, or we make a decision and move forward, but we didn't properly communicate with everyone, and now we've lost a whole group that didn't know we were moving forward, and they feel left out. So being careful in how we move is key. So balancing those two things is really important, and not letting kind of the urgency of the world around us dictate our speed and our movements. True executive presence, we take in all those factors, but we move at the speed that we want to move at, not the speed that the world is pressuring us to move at. Again, that doesn't mean we don't consider those things. We're more intentional. And then so we're going to round out our list here with a few more. This is the bottom of the list: embodies what the organization stands for, and inspiring and courageous. So let's talk about both of those to round out our list. So embodies what the organization stands for. The executives that have executive presence, when you see them, hear them talk, you just get a sense of they kind of live and breathe and frankly bleed that organization. They are just an embodiment of it in both their style and how they communicate, how they show up. They just have that element and aura about them. And so it's being really thoughtful about that. Am I showing up in a way that represents our brand, represents what we stand for, represents our team and our people? I think that's a really important thing to be thoughtful of. And executive presence is every day we walk out the door, we're thinking that to ourselves. Am I showing up in a way that's going to embody not only the organization I represent, but the people I work with every day? And then, of course, inspiring and courageous. Not being afraid to create those really compelling, exciting visions and really leaning on those, even if they're challenging, and having some of those courageous conversations with whoever those parties might be, to be able to really not only honor the organization, defend the organization, but carry the organization into that future. I would say that this last one, inspiring and courageous, probably, if I had to look at most executives today, I would say they're scoring a little lower than they used to on this one. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that because everything is urgent all the time, and if it's a publicly traded company or even privately held that might be owned by a private equity backed company or some other kind of ownership, there's so much pressure to move fast that there's not a lot of vision casting. There's not a lot of inspiration. It's mostly just speed of execution. And that's a good for an operator, but not necessarily embodying executive presence. So I would encourage all of us to think a little bit about what inspiring and courageous means to you. So I was wrapping up an engagement with a client of mine last year, and I was a senior leader in one of the businesses I was working with. And she said, she was in a meeting and someone had challenged her and said, what would it look like next year if we were 20% braver? And I thought that was such a good, exciting challenge. And as executives, we should all take on a challenge like that. What would it look like if we were 20% braver this year? That's going to get us closer to some of those traits at the bottom, particularly inspiring and courageous. So that's our master list. A couple final things around this, and then I've got a few more points, and then we'll open it up for some questions. I was doing our course on leadership presence and executive communication. And I was doing this course a few years ago, and we had someone more junior in the course. And they asked me, they said, Brandon, I'm in my 20s, I'm a manager. Where do I start on this list? And it's exactly the way we laid out. Start at the top left and work your way down that first column, and then shift over to the second column and work your way down. So we want to make sure we really get listens, leads with questions, recognizes others, before we start jumping into inspiring and courageous. They're all great, but if you've got a couple items on this list that you've identified, you want to start with the ones closer to the left-hand column. The second point I'd want to add about this list, I am not suggesting that you should go out and do all these things on this list starting tomorrow. This list represents a perfect human being. No one can be exceptional at all these things, but it can be a really great way to identify blind spots or derailers that each of us might have. So if you notice a blind spot or a derailer, focus on that first, because we don't want anything to kind of throw us off the track of being an executive. I was coaching a couple clients a few years ago, and they were getting dinged on the same thing. They were senior leaders, and they were one level below the C-suite. And every time they presented, they were giving operational updates. And because they weren't talking about the strategy first, the executives saw them as operators not having executive presence, not strategists. So even sometimes just leaving out important elements in how we communicate can also shift people's views of us. So Nicola mentioned, this was almost 10 years ago now, I did a TED Talk on the contagiousness of emotions in the workplace. And of course, we can all agree that yes, emotions are contagious in the workplace. There's been a growing body of research on that since the mid-1990s. Turns out that not all emotions are equally contagious. Some are more contagious than others. If you are curious, fear and anxiety is the most contagious. And if we're the leader, it's like 2x. So I share that story and example with you today because part of being an executive and leader, frankly, is also asking ourselves, how am I arriving with my team today? If you're showing up anxious and kind of worried and stressed out, your team's going to feel anxious and worried and stressed out. So sometimes we need to be the kind of the rock in the storm. We need to be that calm presence. But as another leader shared with me a few years ago, she said, I know I need to light a fire in my people, which is inspiration, but sometimes I need to light a fire under them too, which is urgency. So more than anything, it's about being intentional about how we're going to show up. Do we need to be the person kind of lighting fires today, or do we need to be that steady rock in the storm for our teams? Okay, here's our list one more time. So as you're thinking about this list, maybe you're noticing some of the items on the right-hand column as possible derailers for us. If that's the case, just think about if there's any either items on the list that you have a strong reaction to, or any questions you might have, and include those in the chat. So at this point, I'm going to just kind of pause. Naturally, with all these kinds of sessions, whether it's business over breakfast or other courses I teach, I always like to wrap up by challenging each of us to think about what's that one thing I could either start doing, stop doing, or continue doing. Again, I don't want you coming away from this business over breakfast session with 10 items. I'd rather you come away with one thing you either want to start doing, stop doing, or continue doing. So hopefully there was something on that list that you can take away and say, huh, yeah, I'd like to work that in. So I'm going to pause here. Nicola, what kinds of questions have come up in the chat, or anything that might
Oh
be?
my goodness.
Okay.
There are lots of questions, Brandon. Andy said, can you talk about authenticity, especially in appearance? The balance between dressing for the role you want or faking it till you make it and being true to yourself?
Yeah, so it's reminding me of a leader some years ago, and she worked for a large global consulting firm. And consulting firms, like a lot of other places, they've got kind of their uniform, their unspoken. And she wore the uniform great, but she would always have one kind of bling element that she would wear. So it could be kind of a nice kind of a scarf, or it could be kind of a floral arrangement, just something to show off her personality. So that's what I would encourage. I would say fundamentally, really be thoughtful and watch, how do other leaders in this organization show up? What's their uniform? And then what's the one little thing I could maybe get away with that shows my personality, but still stays true to the uniform? Because you're right, we want to show up as our authentic selves. That said, we also want to honor our organization. So I'll give one more element around this. This has to do with Emory Hospital. I was doing work with the medical school a few years ago, and it was with kind of quick charging and elevating leaders that had come from other medical schools and other hospitals around the country. And so we were doing this session for them. They were kind of high potentials at Emory. And one of the leaders raised their hand and said, I notice around here, all the male physicians, they wear ties, press shirts. Basically, they wear a suit except for their white medical jacket. But they're suited up other than that. He said, I'm not used to that. I come from hospitals in the Northeast. Everyone would just wear scrubs. And it was a kind of older physician there. And he said, yeah, well, around here, the reason why we do that is we're trying to create comfort for the patients, that we're knowledgeable, that we're experts, and that we know what's going on. We want that image to carry over as confident and as credible. So that was the culture at Emory Hospital and the medical school for many, many years. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but it was really to convey that message. So if you're going to go up in Emory Medical School, you better be ready to dress a little nicer, because they want that image to be conveyed.
Bob asks, how do you view curiosity as an often underrated yet powerful trait in shaping executive and professional presence?
Incredibly powerful to not only have executives learn, because if you're curious, you're going to learn a lot more about the business. Ask questions, go to site visits, get curious. That's how you really show up as a true executive. People will see you as caring and empathetic. So when I've done kind of research around curiosity, because it's something I'm very passionate about as a therapist, people they experience it as empathy. Oh, you asked me questions about me. You care. You want to learn about what's going on with me. But there is one subtle thing to avoid. Avoid starting your question with why. When you start the question with why, that's a critical question. It's a judgment question. You're creating a judgment statement. Why did you wear that today? Why did you show up at 9:03? Immediately puts people on the defensive. So if you can get there without opening with why, like, well, tell me more about how this came about versus why did you do it this way? It can help preserve that executive presence and create open dialogue. But it's also a good important point to remember. People don't always see us as us. They see us first as our titles. So you may be just Bob, but if you show up as a senior vice president, they see SVP Bob first, SVP. So when you say why, they immediately think they're going to get fired. So we've got to be careful that while we're curious, it's not creating a defensiveness.
Mhm. As we're talking about these traits, Dina is asking, are there applications for these traits that are gender dependent? And there was also another question around where you are in your career. I mean, age related approaches. Are there differences there? So gender and then age.
Yes to both of those. So let's start with age first. Some of the items on the right, you can get away with violating those when you're a manager, maybe even a director, earlier in your 30s. You can get away with not necessarily needing to stick to those. In fact, you might even be getting pressure to do the opposite. You're trying to slow down and bring everyone along, and your leader's saying, "No, get this done by Friday. Don't worry about the politics of it." Or maybe they're not even saying that. They just want you to get it done by Friday. So sometimes that has elements to it too.
Mhm.
So I would age the where age comes in is learning to slow down tends to be something we develop over time. Learning patience is a wisdom and life skill. We don't come out of the womb with patience. We're a pretty impatient bunch when we're 3 years old. I'm a pretty impatient guy right now at 51. So we learn that as we get a little older. So I do think there's some elements there around both our natural growth as people, but also timing. Now let's talk about gender. Yes, everything I mentioned here would apply either way, whether you're a male leader or female leader. There are a couple elements that do make this a little more complicated. Female leaders historically tend to be held to a higher standard. So, a man can come across as a little gruff and rough, and they get a pass. Female leader does that, she doesn't get the same pass. Uh, and same thing, a man can come across as super nice and sweet, and they're like, oh, he's such a nice guy. And a female leader does that, and they say, she's not serious. So there's almost not the same amount of grace. Now, I will also say, just to be clear, the folks holding those female leaders to that standard are just as equal as females as they are males. It's not like the males are dinging them and the females are like, you go. That's not the case. Both groups are holding them to that standard. I don't know how that's shifting as we're starting to see more female leaders in senior roles. The other element that also makes this a little complicated is if you have an all-female organization, they may have a different set of expectations of their female leader. So think about maybe environments where most of the staff, if not all the staff, is female. Same thing would be true if it's all male. There's going to be slight differences when you've got kind of a very singular gender being represented in an environment.
Thank you. Michael asks, any tips we can use to help ourselves slow down when we're always busy with tons of priorities, high pressure, etc.?
Yeah, a good friend of mine, Randy Hain, he always preaches, put air in your calendar. So a lot of the things that we're talking about here today, if you want to operationalize those, figure out a way to actually put them into Outlook, assuming you use Microsoft Outlook. But figure out a way to put it in your calendar. So for example, what I coach my leaders to do is if you can find a way to carve out, say, 3 hours once a week, like on a Friday or some other time where you can pause and reflect and think, that time gives you that opportunity to kind of reset. So using another interesting example, this was many, many, many years ago, back when I played some golf. I don't golf much anymore. I was golfing with a McDonald's franchise owner. And he said, I really admire those Chick-fil-A operators. I said, oh, why? Is it the culture? He said, oh, that's nice. He says, they get Sunday off. They get a day to pause, not just because they're resting, but they can pause, reflect on the week, and do an operational reset for the next week. We're McDonald's. We don't get to do that. It's 7 days a week. So I love that example too. Is there a way you can create like a break or a pause, a moment to kind of reflect and reset? Because so much of what we talked about today just requires intentionality until it becomes a habit for you. So creating that space for that.
Yeah, it's hard. Oh, we've got
Oh,
so many questions,
goodness,
Brandon.
Nicola. Goodness, I tell you, getting that block and that, I mean, I make it sound easy. That's of all the things I tell my clients to do, that's the last one they are able to achieve because it's so hard when you have all this pressure and all this work that you got to get done.
Yeah. Um, what are some of the different, Bryant asks, what are some of the different characteristics between executive presence and ego?
I would say it's a balance between that confident and humble. Okay, so when we think about this, let's talk about confident and humble and how Brian asked the question. Confident is, I know who I am. I'm confident in my skills. I'm confident in my competencies. I'm as a mentor of mine would say, I'm enough in my limitedness. I'm not perfect, but I can do this job. But they also recognize, and I don't have all the answers. So that same mentor that shared with me, I'm enough in my limitedness, also said, we all hold a piece of the truth. And recognizing I don't hold all the answers. So I'll give you an example. He's regularly listed as one of the worst CEOs of all time. His name was Bob Nardelli. If you're not familiar with Bob, he was a GE guy, ran Home Depot for a while, was invited to leave. He went over to, I believe it might have been Dodge Chrysler, I think is where he went next. He would take a car home every day, a different car. He would write notes on it and then give it back to the engineering team and say, these are all the things you need to make changes of. Bob decided he was essentially smart enough to be better than any kind of surveys, focus groups. He knew all the answers. That's where ego gets too far. We need to make sure that we're balancing our confidence in ourselves, but also recognize it's more like leader as facilitator. We got to pull out as many answers as we can from the system and don't think we've got them all up in our head. So that's the way I would kind of look at that.
I think we've got time for one last question, and we've got so many here. I'm trying to choose which one. Let's say Josu says, if you were to survey Fortune 100 executives, what percentage of them would say they have executive presence? And I wonder if the desire for lifelong learning and self-improvement simply manifests itself as an executive presence, even though we might not feel like the executive name in our title. I think there's a couple of questions in there.
Yeah. I think if you ask most Fortune 100 executives, do they have executive presence? They probably 95% of them would say no, they don't have it, but that's because that's the proper answer to give. I think most of them would get to that level by having it. You're not going to get there in a Fortune 100 company because of the scale. So once a company hits 3 billion in revenue, it ceases to become a company and it morphs into a government. So when you've got Fortune 100s, there are so many people. You're essentially working with large governments. You have to be able to not only manage performance but politics. These folks have risen to their ranks because they do both really, really well. So I would say that's an important piece. The second one, to your point around lifelong learning, I think that is a great trait of executive presence, whether we call it executive presence or not. How about just trying to expand ourselves to be the optimal humans that we can be and make the biggest impact in the world? And I think the more we learn about ourselves and learn about things around us, that continuous learning keeps us humble, keeps us open, and embodies a lot of the things we talked about today. So that's a nice kind of spirit that I think we can kind of all leave this call with. And of course, in the spirit of continuous learning, we have wonderful courses in executive education,
including yours, Brandon.
this one. And this course that we teach this course twice a year in the spring and in the fall, and it fills up every session that we offer. So if it's a course you're interested in, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to the executive ed team sooner than later to get your name on the list.
Absolutely.
Nicola, I think we're probably at my time, so let me
We are
hand
at
the ball
time.
back over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brandon. And I am going to pass over to Pam to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. What a great conversation today. And thanks for making it a conversation. I know you've not been able to pay attention to 100% of what's been going on in the chat, but just lots of love, lots of thank yous, and lots of incredible ideas and input. So you'll have to screen through that real quick. Before we close, we love always sharing what is coming next on Business Over Breakfast. So I just realized all of my Q&A and all that's still showing. So let me see if I can get this to pop up here. So coming up on March the 20th is Innovation in Action for Everyday Work with Scott Sanchez. We are excited to bring him back to Business Over Breakfast. Always a highlight when he is here, super energetic and gives us new things to think about. And then coming up, as Nicola mentioned on the front end of our webinar today, we have a number of great courses. So featuring all of our courses, including our online asynchronous, as well as our in-person courses, leveraging AI in business. One thing Nicola didn't mention was our managerial leadership course. It is for those who are currently in a managerial role, as well as those who are aspiring. Gives insight into your own leadership style, some of those elements of executive presence that Brandon was talking about today, and helps you become a better leader of your team, inspiring in your communication, and understanding how your own leadership shows up. And then, of course, our course, which features Brandon and other faculty executive communication and leadership presence. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day and through the weekend. We look forward to seeing you on our next Business Over Breakfast. Have a great rest of the week.